Have you ever wondered how archaeologists piece together the stories of ancient peoples? They dig up artifacts, sure, but how do they connect a specific pot from one site to a burial style from another, hundreds of miles away? For over a century, the answer has often been a single, powerful word: culture. But is this concept, which seems so intuitive, actually holding archaeology back? A groundbreaking new study is forcing the field to take a hard look in the mirror. Let's travel back to the early 20th century. Imagine you're an archaeologist like Gustav Cassina. You're uncovering distinctive pottery styles, unique burial rituals, and specific types of tools, all repeatedly found together in a certain region. Cassina proposed a revolutionary idea: clearly defined, sharply distinct archaeological provinces correspond in all periods to the territories of particular peoples or tribes. In simpler terms, if you find a bunch of similar stuff, it probably belonged to a single, unified group of people, culture. This became the foundation of what's known as the culture-historical approach. It was a game changer. Suddenly, archaeologists had a way to draw maps of the past, tracing the movements and territories of ancient peoples based on the distribution of their material remains. Think of the Beaker people or the corded ware culture. These names, which you might have heard before, come directly from this way of thinking. They're defined by their most characteristic artifacts, a specific type of drinking vessel or pottery with cord-like impressions. This method was incredibly useful. It allowed archaeologists to create timelines and organize the immense, chaotic puzzle of the past into neat, understandable boxes. It gave a sense of order to prehistory. For a long time, this was just how archaeology was done. You found a pot, you identified its culture, and you placed it on the map. Simple, right? Well, not quite. The problem is, people are messy, and so is history. By the 1960s, a new generation of archaeologists, part of the New Archaeology or processual movement, started asking some tough questions. They argued that the old approach was too simplistic. It was great at describing asterisk what asterisk was found in asterisk where asterisk, but it was terrible at explaining asterisk why asterisk. Why did people make pots that way? Why did their burial customs change? Just saying it's their culture wasn't a real answer. It was a label, a description, not an explanation. These critics pointed out that a culture isn't a single living thing that makes decisions. People do. Individuals and groups make choices based on their environment, their social relationships, their economy, and their beliefs. The processualists wanted to make archaeology more scientific. They wanted to understand the processes that shaped human behavior, not just slap a cultural label on a pile of artifacts. And then came an even bigger critique, one that uncovered a much darker side to the concept. Scholars from the post-processual movement highlighted the troubling political history of the archaeological culture concept. Remember Gustav Cassina, the pioneer of the idea? His work was later co-opted and used by the Nazi regime in Germany to justify territorial expansion. The logic was dangerously simple. If ancient Germanic cultures once lived in a particular area, then that land rightfully belonged to modern Germany. This showed how easily the idea of neatly defined ancient cultures could be twisted to serve nationalist and racist agendas. The critics argued that drawing sharp lines on a map and labeling them Culture A and Culture B is not just inaccurate, it can be dangerous. It creates a false sense of ancient, unchanging ethnic identities and pure, homogeneous groups, which has rarely been the reality of human history. People have always moved, mixed, traded, and shared ideas. A pot style might spread because of trade, not because a whole people migrated. A burial practice could be adopted by different groups for various reasons. The links between pots and peoples were far more complex than the early culture historians had assumed. So, with all these problems, as lack of explanatory power and its ugly political baggage, do you think archaeologists would have thrown the concept of culture into the dustbin of history, right? Here's where it gets really interesting. They didn't. And that's the central question of a recent study by archaeologist Johanna Brinkman and philosopher Vesa Arponen from Kiel University. They wanted to understand why, despite decades of harsh criticism, culture is still so deeply embedded in archaeology. Their research, published in the journal Germania dives into this persistence. They found that, even though most archaeologists today are well aware of the concept's problematic history and its limitations, they still find it incredibly difficult to get rid of. It's like a habit that's too hard to break. Why is that? Brinkman and our opponents suggest a few key reasons. First, there's a practical element. Archaeologists work with massive amounts of data. They need a way to sort and classify it, a basic vocabulary to describe patterns in the material they find. Terms like linear pottery culture or funnel beaker culture are, at their core, useful shorthand. They're quick, convenient labels for a recurring set of artifacts found in a certain time and place. It's a tool for initial classification, a first step in making sense of the chaos. Imagine trying to describe every single find without using these collective terms. It would be incredibly cumbersome. You'd be saying, the group of people who made this specific type of pot with incised lines and lived in this river valley between 4,500 and 4,000 BC, it's much easier to just use the established cultural name as a starting point, even if you know it's an oversimplification. The second reason is more philosophical. Brinkman and our opponent point out that while some critics argued that culture isn't a real, tangible thing, others have pushed back. They argue that shared traditions, norms, and ways of doing things are real. They genuinely influence how people live and behave. We can see this in our own lives. The way we dress, the food we eat, the language we speak, these are all part of a shared cultural context. These scholars argue that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Instead of abandoning the concept of culture altogether, we need to redefine it. We need to think of it not as a rigid, unchanging box that contains a single people, but as a dynamic and fluid set of traditions that people actively use, change, and negotiate in their daily lives. Culture isn't a blueprint, it's a toolbox. People pick and choose different tools, different artifact styles, different practices to build their identities and navigate their social worlds. So, where does this leave us? The study by Brinkman and our opponent doesn't call for the complete abandonment of culture. Instead, it calls for conceptual hygiene. They urge archaeologists to be much more careful and explicit about what they mean when they use the word. When an archaeologist talks about the corded ware culture, are they talking about a specific ethnic group that migrated across Europe? Or are they simply referring to a shared package of material goods and practices, cord-impressed pottery, battle axes, single grave burials that became popular across a wide area for a variety of complex social and economic reasons? The difference is huge. The key is to move from using culture as a lazy explanation to using it as a starting point for deeper questions. Okay, so we see a pattern we call the bell beaker phenomenon. Now, let's ask the real questions. Why did this package of artifacts and practices spread so widely and so quickly across Europe? Was it migration, trade, the spread of a new ideology or belief system, a new way of drinking, a status symbol? Or most likely a complex combination of all of these, playing out differently in different regions? This is where archaeology gets truly exciting. By combining traditional artifact analysis with modern scientific techniques like ancient DNA analysis and isotope studies, which can trace individual human origins and movements, we can start to unravel these complex histories. We can see that the spread of the beaker package involves some migration, but also a lot of local adoption and adaptation by different groups. The story is not a simple map of one people moving across the land, but a tangled, fascinating web of human connection and interaction. The research from Kiel University serves as a powerful reminder. The words we use matter. The concepts we build our knowledge on need to be constantly examined and refined. In archaeology, the seemingly simple concept of culture has been both a useful tool and a dangerous trap. The future of the discipline lies in recognizing this dual nature, using it carefully as a descriptive label while always pushing for deeper, more nuanced explanations of our shared human past. It's about acknowledging the mezzanines of history and embracing the complexity of the human story, a story that can never be confined to neat little boxes. So next time you see a museum exhibit about an ancient culture, remember the complicated story behind that label. It represents a century of debate, a tool for understanding, and a warning from history all rolled into one. Thanks for watching, and if you're fascinated by how we uncover the stories of the past, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives. See you next time.